That's the seventh consciousness is about self.
Seven consciousness, you heard from where?
From one Mahayana monk. And the eighth consciousness is the alaya consciousness. I thought alaya consciousness was the memory. Is it? Is it just the memory, or is it more?
There was one sharing, I will forward it to you. That one, a lot of people go and listen. The difference between awareness and consciousness. I describe all the 9 types of consciousness, not only 8. The Mahayana got 8, there's another 9 consciousness, but that 9 consciousness is not really a consciousness. That one is Nibbana. So what they tell you, you find it confusing is because you are not exposed to the Mahayana type of explanation or sharing. It's actually the same. I explained in that talk. That one I explained very clearly. Although they classify under 1 to 8 consciousness, is actually essentially the 5 aggregates of form and mind. No different. So maybe I go through quickly, then you go and listen. You see, we have our 5 physical senses, okay? The eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the tactile. Together with the brain, we have our 6 centers. So the first 5, what they call consciousness, are basically our physical sense or consciousness. When we are having the ability to see, that is seeing consciousness. Ability to hear, we are conscious of what we hear, that is hearing consciousness. So seeing, hearing, smell, taste, and tactile are the first 5 consciousness of mind. Then the 6th consciousness is actually perception, because that one is the mind. The mind that perceives through all the senses will create that type of perception consciousness. Of course, it needs the mind. So the mind, which is through the brain, create perception. That's why you need the brain to create the 6th consciousness. So 6th consciousness is actually sanya, perception. You understand? Then the 7th consciousness is actually sankhara. That's why they call it the discriminating consciousness. It's not self-consciousness. It's the egoic consciousness, discriminating consciousness. It creates discrimination at that time. Or they call determining consciousness, when it makes that intention to discriminate. Before you have the wisdom and the enlightenment, it is the discriminating consciousness. So what is happening is sankhara, they always treat it like an organ. It's the organ in the mind. So when your perception bring in the external form, you know what happened or not? Upon contact with the brain, that's why the Paticca Samuppada say, avijja paccaya sankhara. You see, sankhara. So sankhara is actually the 7 consciousness organ. Then sankhara paccaya vinnanam, it trigger off the 8 consciousness. So what happened is the perception bring in the form. So the mind, through its accumulated views, opinion, and conditioning and belief system, will create the determining consciousness. So that one is like an organ. So the sense data is the perception. That's why it triggers off thought consciousness. So the 8 consciousness, there is a thought consciousness. But they call it alaya because they create a new term and say there is a storehouse consciousness that store all your karmic consciousness. There is no such thing. There is a karmic nature, yes. But when you talk about storehouse of consciousness, it's just like referring to the karmic nature, karmic consciousness. It is all about karmic. But they want to make the teaching different. That's why they call it alaya. This alaya is before enlightenment. That's why it has all this rubbish inside there. When the alaya consciousness is being like transcended, then the whole thing loses its power. That's why when you become enlightened, technically the Arahant and beyond, they do not take rebirth. That's why karma has no power over their rebirth, because they do not die through delusion or ignorance. Yeah. So that's what the 6, 7, and 8 consciousness is all about. So the 7 consciousness is actually the discriminating consciousness. But you treat it as an organ, then easy. The sense data from that perception brings in the external sense object for the sankhara to actually trigger off the 8 consciousness, which is the thought consciousness. That's why avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vinnanam. So vinnanam is the pure consciousness at that time, before the content of consciousness went in. But that one, only enlightened being can be at that moment of pure consciousness. Most people immediately condition namarup. That's why avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vinnanam, vinnanam paccaya namarupa. Namarupa is with the content of consciousness. And that one becomes the thought. That's why from the alaya consciousness, the thought rise.
Oh.
You can listen to that sharing. The sharing is very good. First 5 consciousness is a sense door consciousness. Yeah, you got it? Seeing, hearing, smell, taste, tactile consciousness. There's 6 consciousness is perception, sanya. See? So these are the internalized mental form through perception. So this one is where you create the thinking after that. The discriminative consciousness is the sankhara, the thinking part. So you start to discriminate like, dislike, and all those things. Then you trigger off the 8 consciousness, which is alaya consciousness. So I put a dot underneath the 7 consciousness, sankhara. Sankhara as a mental organ to trigger off the alaya consciousness after receiving the sense data from sanya. You understand? It's like the physical experiment. Upon contact, consciousness come to be. So the 8 consciousness of Vinnanam is actually the storehouse consciousness, summation of all your karmic volition. You go and listen to the video sharing, Thursday class at Suyan's house is very, very clear. And that one explained clearly between awareness, the difference between awareness and consciousness.